Connect with your potential customers wherever they are. Effective uses Comcast viewership data insights to combine advanced targeting capabilities with premium TV and streaming content, so you can deliver the best ad experiences to your audience no matter how they watch. Visit EFFECTV.com.
Hello world, you're listening to Strategicon, your window to all things security and foreign affairs. The Kurdish Regional Government, or KRG, of northern Iraq sits at the crossroads of many of the Middle East's key conflicts. There is the obvious conflict between itself and Baghdad over the contested region of oil-rich Kirkuk. There is the aspiration of the KRG political leadership in Erbil to go it alone and carve out for itself greater autonomy from Iraqi national authorities, with which it seems to have widening differences over such issues as the transshipment of oil through KRG territory and the sharing of Iraqi national wealth for regional development. Then there are the international issues, such as the KRG being seen as the torchbearer of Kurdish nationalist aspirations, linking up with other Kurdish nationalists in Turkey, Iran and Syria. Today we are joined by regular guest Professor Albert Wolf, who has recently moved from Afghanistan to the KRG. Albert is now Dean, College of International Studies, the American University of Kurdistan, Dohuk, Iraq, where we will talk about the KRG, Iraq, Iran and Syria. Also joining us today is SIA's Associate and Resident Existentialist Philosopher, David Olney. Before we start today's episode, I would like to remind listeners that Strategicon can be found on iTunes, SoundCloud, Stitcher, TuneIn, YouTube, and on the Sage International Australia website, www.sageinternational.org.au. Albert, welcome back to Strategicon for this, our 50th episode.
It's great to be back, and it's great to be on this special episode. Thank you.
And a hearty welcome back to our existentialist philosopher, David Olney, who has just managed to pull himself away from his teaching commitments at the University of Adelaide for this milestone episode. Greetings, David.
Thank you to be here on this auspicious occasion. And tomorrow I start marking, so this is the end of the good bits.
Let's start off with a hot-button contemporary issue. It has been said that this year Baghdad lost some $5 billion in revenue because the Iraqi government of Hadi al Amiri refused to make a deal with the Kurdish Regional Government, or KRG, over exporting oil from the contested area of Kirkuk. This can't be good for a weak, fragmented Iraqi state. How are issues like this seen from the KRG's perspective, Albert?
One thing that a lot of people talk about from the KRG's perspective is that the Shabi, with the blessing of the Abadi government, seized Kirkuk, and this was a major blow to the KRG. So the thing is that's emphasized here is not that that Baghdad has lost this $5 billion. It's that there's been billions of dollars of revenue that's been lost on the part of the KRG. Also, many in the KRG emphasize that Baghdad owes them money and hasn't paid up for some time, along with, as coalition, these coalition talks keep going and going, a number of promises have gone unfulfilled, like the Second Chamber of Parliament, Supreme Court, etc.
In Kirkuk, there are reports that federal monies slated for distribution have not reached the area for some 4 years, meaning that important civil works programs have stalled. Kirkuk is another major sore point between the KRG and Iraq, both claiming the area and its oil reserves for themselves. How do bad relations between Prime Minister Nurchevan Barzani of the KRG and Iraqi Prime Minister Hadi al Amiri over the oil and the status of Kirkuk factor in keeping the contemporary Iraqi state from functioning as an effective political and economic unit?
Well, let's remember, Abadi is on the way out. Barzani is not. And that is one important reality. And as it goes forward, there have been rumors that Barzani is going to there was a brilliant piece by Peter Galbraith in Foreign Policy, the U.S. Magazine, I'm sure you guys read down there, talking about this, that he could throw his lot in with either the Sadr Sairoon Alliance or Haider al Amiri's group, or possibly both, which are, Haider al Amiri is explicitly pro-Iranian. And there's a couple of reasons for this, partly because the U.S. has sort of taken the Kurds for granted. So that plays a big role in it. And, I think that you could have a more functioning, or there could be more functioning Iraq if he were to throw his lot in there. Now, there's certain complications that come with this, namely, the Iranians have had a missile strike against a group called the KDPI, which have been, Kurdish dissidents that have been operating from within Kurdistan against Iran. So I think that the bad relationship with Abadi is going to be yesterday's news very shortly.
Albert, do you think Iran is going to accept a new prime minister and the Kurds perhaps working more effectively together, or will they feel the need to act as a spoiler agent, making sure that Iraq stays compliant and the Kurds stay isolated?
I would remember just a couple of things. The first is that Iraq is not Frederikian Prussia by any means. They're not even close. And the Kurds, by united, I mean the Kurds among themselves, they seem pretty united. There's an ongoing coalition between the KDP and the PUK. Now, the thing is that how well it works with Baghdad, I think it's going to depend upon the kinds of concessions that the central government gives to the Kurdish coalition. If they give them all sorts of, let's say they're not unlikely to do this, but as a thought experiment, they give them all the concessions they want, then they're going to try and act. Then I would predict the Iranians would act as spoilers. If Baghdad is willing to clamp down, which I don't know that they have if they would have the will to do so, like they did under Abadi when he shut down, say, the airports in Erbil, for instance, then they're not going to have as much of an incentive to do so, because Baghdad would be giving them what they want. They obviously don't want an independent Kurdistan. They don't want those dominoes to fall within their own country, etc.
Albert, pipeline politics is an interesting thing to follow in Iraq. There has been talk that perhaps the KRG is unfairly using its position along the north-south Iraqi pipeline that leads into Turkey, is unfairly punishing the Iraqi government because of its strategic location. There has also been talk that there's the likelihood of another alternative route to Turkey being thought of, at least in Baghdad somewhere. But considering the current state of chaos at the moment, is it likely that such a pipeline could actually allow the government in Baghdad to move around the KRG in terms of its oil politics?
That's a good question. The honest answer is I don't know, because I can only speculate. I believe that on the one hand they do have an incentive to do this. The past several years, one of the major priorities in Turkish foreign economic policy has been to get energy anywhere and everywhere they possibly can. There's such a multiplicity of veto players in Baghdad, getting anything done is difficult. On the other hand, they've had a productive relationship with the KRG, up until present, so I don't know how much it would be worth their while. Plus, we have to take into account the very practical fact, all the logistical considerations of doing a new pipeline. This stuff takes time, frankly. So I'm a little skeptical about that. So if the Kurds say go for another referendum, for instance, or there's some let's say Erdogan sees it in his political interest to scapegoat the Kurds again, my answer would be maybe. But if everything stays the same, ceteris paribus, then I would say no. I don't see it as being in their interest at this time.
Based on the complexity of undertaking a project like a big new pipeline, is there any evidence at the moment of infrastructure projects going ahead to sort of re-equip the Iraqi economy for functioning within a broader regional economy? Or is it that there are just too many spoilers in Baghdad and nearly no big projects get started immaterial of who they benefit?
To tell you the truth, not that I am aware of, and this is part of the problem, is that a lot of people who do comparative political economy go back and forth on the resource-rich curse, whether it exists, how much it exists, what its effects are, and I've had mixed feelings on it. But I do believe that in the Iraqi case, and living through it, you see it every day. Clearly Iraq is not Dubai, and you're not seeing the big infrastructure projects. You're not seeing anything along the lines of, say, in the U.S., we had the Civilian Conservation Corps, for instance. You're not seeing the building projects like you saw in Dubai, or like you see in Dubai, or that you see in a place like you saw in Spain for years, or even with the Palestinians for years before their economy just fell apart due to war and things like that. So, no, we're not seeing that. And part of it is spoilers, but part of it, I think, is just rent-seeking.
Okay, so, whereas we saw with sort of Chechnya and with Russia in Grozny that it was in their interest to find the money to rebuild it because it was a way to pacify a population, no one's realised here that actually if you got on with a building boom, you could give a whole pile of young men something to do, an income, social status, and actually reduce a lot of political tension. The rent-seeking is so bad it can't get started.
Right.
Okay.
Right. No, I think you're absolutely right on that.
Mind you, though, returning to what I was saying before with regard to civil works programs having stalled in the KRG, I mean, if that's even remotely true, then of course that will prohibit the government from moving forward in a positive way in that sense, wouldn't it? I mean, to diversify the local economy. Okay, Albert, since moving to Iraqi Kurdistan, what can you tell us about your observations so far? In Australia, we hear very little about the region since the demise of ISIS in Iraq. Is the situation really under control? Have ISIS forces been thoroughly defeated within Iraq? Is there a residual ISIS presence there? And if so, what threat does it pose?
Well, living living in the KRG, it's very safe. I haven't faced any problems whatsoever. I can travel around freely. I can go out at night. You should remember, I used to live in Afghanistan. It's like night and day. Now, going to Mosul is a different story, which to say it looks like Berlin after the war is, somewhat of an understatement. It's been devastated and remains somewhat devastated. Right now, the story is that ISIS has been, done and dusted. But there is a concern, and this is coming with, what's going to come next with Idlib, is that we could get ISIS-2 or some successor to ISIS. And a concern that I have is that with another a big refugee crisis can come big support for, the remnants of ISIS that lived in, that were in Syria and could come across into Iraq again. That's a personal fear and concern.
Albert, if there's a fear potentially of a refugee flow back across the border and bringing back ISIS 2, 3, 4, that raises the question, what's happened to units like the Golden Brigade that were so important in Mosul? Is there a presence across Iraq? Are they busy preparing to enhance the level of security? Or have units like that been recalled to Baghdad in barracks sort of peeling grapes and eating dates?
The honest answer, I would love to give you a better answer than this. The honest answer is that I do not know what has happened with the Golden Brigades. I think that they've been overstated I think that they got the best analogy I have is sort of like the Free French in the Second World War. They got a lot of the glory for the work that the communists did. And, as reprehensible as the Hashd al-Shabi is, they did a lot of the work. The Peshmerga did a lot of work too. I don't know what the Golden Brigades are doing now. I have no idea. I know that the Peshmerga just received assistance, I believe, from the Dutch and German, the defense ministries to work on professionalization, for example. The Peshmerga, the Hashd al-Shabi, as you know, are divided, there's 7 big divisions among, I don't mean military divisions, I mean 7 almost political divisions among the Hashd. I don't know how those play out in the event of a recurrence or a return of ISIS. I honestly don't put a lot of faith in the Golden Brigades because of their past performance.
You just answered my question really, really well, because that was my assumption from how little we can find out here. That what you're really seeing is the cohesive cultural groups that put together hardcore militias are of course still functional. The artificial confection of a state that doesn't really function has of course vaporized. So thank you for actually answering that really well.
Thank you.
Albert, has the effectiveness of the Kurdish militia, the Peshmerga, against ISIS translated into improved border security between the KRG and Syria, which has long been known to be a route for jihadists moving within the northern Iraqi space into Syria?
Honestly, as far as I know, no. Now, I don't know of a ton of people coming in from Syria, but I don't know if it's because they're busy fighting in Syria or it's because they've been destroyed. But I have a colleague who goes regularly into Rojava using a taxi cab. I'm quite serious. I mean, he just goes, does field research without any sort of a hassle. So, and he's urged me to go, and I've politely declined. And I mean, it's just my gut. I mean, not having gone there is no, I don't believe so at this time.
We're very glad that you politely declined.
Yeah.
Yeah, so am I.
Hey, listen, we could do Strategicon out of Rojava, yeah?
Well, you're welcome. You're welcome to.
Oh, yeah.
And I believe if you gentlemen are interested, Iraqi Air has started flights back to Damascus. So
Wow.
Nice.
I can't guarantee you any special rates, but I mean, you're welcome to take that trip if you really bent on it. So.
Thanks very much for your kind offer, but no, we're quite nice and safe here in Adelaide.
We just have too much. We just have too much excess luggage with the armoured car.
Indeed. Look, Albert, as alluded to earlier, the relationship between the KRG and Baghdad is strained. Much of this is to do with the sentiment being held by the people of Iraqi Kurdistan that they could go it alone, that Baghdad has always been a force of oppression rather than a natural ally of Kurdish aspirations. Do you think there'll be a time when the de facto autonomy of the KRG becomes a reality, officially recognized as true independence from Baghdad? And if not, why not?
I don't. Well, there is. Well, as you said, there is de facto autonomy. I do believe that last year, after the referendum, Baghdad did show its teeth in a way that surprised a lot of people, myself included. When Abadi shut down the airports in places like Erbil, that surprised me. I didn't think that Baghdad had that kind of strength, quite frankly. So I think that if they're going to do it, they're going to have to basically, do the things that you would expect states to do. Establish a monopoly over the use of violence within a locale. Whether that's, something, I don't know whether it's politically feasible for Barzani, but say, wipe out the KDPI like the Iranians want. Pursue a totally independent foreign policy. Cut deals on water with Turkey, for instance. All of these sorts of things. And one thing important to remember, the U.S. is building one of the largest consulates in Erbil, one of the largest consulates in the region in Erbil. Now, that's not an embassy, but in some ways it's an embassy. So, but do I think they're going to get, autonomy in the way that they want? No. I think that they can get, but I think that the coalition talks, they can get concessions.
This seems very interesting because the first thing that popped into my head there is sort of Somaliland and Puntland, where they'll never ever get independence. But because of the state of the rest of Somalia, they can become a place that people want to live because of the consistency of the life they can have. How do you think it might be if they can continue sort of this, de facto autonomy for Iraqis from tiny minorities? Would the idea of being under a stable Kurdish umbrella, feel okay to the remains of the Yazidis, the remains of the sort of obscure Christian groups, who've been through hell when, IS was in control?
It's a good question. I don't have an answer for you.
Okay.
Because, frankly, I've seen the IDP camps, and on the one hand, it is generous to give these people places to live after the hell they've been through. But if you ever see an IDP camp, it looks like a prison. Okay. They are not pleasant places to be in. They're not pleasant places to live in. And and the Yazidis are scattered, and I don't know any, but I still believe that they are treated very poorly here. So I don't know what the future brings for them.
Albert, while the idea of a united Kurdish people resonates strongly among the Kurdish people of Turkey, Iran, Iraq and Syria, the entire Kurdish area, largely straddling these four principal states, is one known as a hotbed of anti-government activity. Recently, the Iranians went hard against their own Kurdish population. Can you tell us something about this incident?
Well, a couple of things. Even though, it's important not to overstate how homogenous these Kurdish peoples are. There are Kurds that are scattered, yes, throughout Syria, Iraq, Turkey, obviously, Iran. There's some in Armenia, but it's not like it's one actor. And there was a brilliant piece that came out in Middle East Journal back in 2016 that was talking about the battle for ISIS. That there were some of these the militias in Syria were willing to do fighting that the Peshmerga weren't, simply because the Peshmerga faced different threats than groups like the YPG did, right? So that's just one point I want to emphasize. It's not one actor, and I think putting them all together would be very difficult. In Iran, I think you have another set of problems coming together. Part of it is analogous to what happens in Turkey, where, there is some evidence. Barbara Walter at UC San Diego has pointed this out. Ethnic dominoes do fall, that where they see, where you have a multi-ethnic state and a group of the same ethnicity gets independence, it's likely that the next group will get independence. That's one thing they're worried about. Another thing that they're worried, or I would guess that they're worried about, is that, Iran has had no shortage of domestic upheaval lately. Now, it's been largely driven by the economy, and all the slogans about no Palestine, no Syria, focus on Iran, and things of that nature. I think it's been as much about that and trying to keep the country together. And of course, the third point to remember, Iran has not had a census since 1971, and there is a delicate game that they play with ethnic politics in terms of how much do we go for this Persian nationalist stuff, because the Velayat-e Faqih is the governing concept of the Iranian regime. It's not Persian nationalism. Part of the thing you have seen recently, Sfandiar Mashai, right-hand man of Ahmadinejad, is getting it in the neck right now. It's a big signal to Ahmadinejad, and it's largely because he's a real Persian nationalist. He's not a guy who is a theocrat, so to speak. And, they, don't know, either willfully or they're just ignorant, how many Persians are in that country. If they did a real census, you could find out that that Persians are a minority. So clamping down, they have multiple incentives to clamp down, in my view.
Since the toppling of the Sunni dictatorship of Saddam Hussein in 2003, the Shiite national government of Iraq that replaced it has strategically aligned itself toward Iran. But there are some who believe this is a simplistic notion, that Washington still holds some influence in Baghdad, capitalizing on non-sectarian Iraqis wanting to recreate a unified Iraqi state. Of course, the idea of a strong, non-denominational Iraq may well be a good thing for many Iraqis, but the Iranian theocracy over Iraq's eastern border would see it otherwise. The 8-year-long Iran-Iraq war, fought between 1980 to 88, traumatized the leaders of Iran, who may well see the only workable Iraqi state being one that is weak and effectively a vassal of Tehran. In a tussle for influence between Washington and Tehran over the future of Iraq, where do you think the real power lies?
Boy, is that a complicated question.
Yeah.
Part of it is going. Somebody once said to me, this is a little bit of a long and roundabout way of answering this question. It says that whenever a government is being formed in Israel, the United States is always sitting at the table. And I think that when it comes, you notice that like when they started these coalition negotiations in Baghdad back in May, who was at the table? Brett McGurk, the special coordinator for ISIS. You also, and I mean, he had a relationship with Hadi al Amiri. So you have the United States and Iran are both coalition partners. They don't have formal political parties there, but they're both coalition. They're both going to be involved in the coalition no matter what. That's the first thing. The second thing is that I think that in the long term, Iran is going to be there just because they have a border. The United States, in terms of, the United States is not energy independent. You take an economics class, you learn the definition of independence, but it has become far less sensitive to the price of oil than it was just a couple years ago, and less sensitive to the price of oil coming from the Middle East. Now, we talked about this before. I think that, one other thing is the role of the Saudis. Now, the role of the Saudis has been, is not as great as either that of Iran or America. But an idea that I think would work, or would certainly mitigate the security dilemma, would be a Finlandized Iraq. I don't know if we could put the parties together to do that, but certainly something to build upon it would be the plan that Joe Biden, the former vice president, he was then a senator, and Les Gelb, the then president of Council on Foreign Relations, put out in 2006, which was a loosely federal Iraq. I think that is something that is worth visiting. Is a truly Finlandized Iraq that it basically has a neutral or an Austrianized Iraq, something similar to what we had during the Cold War for a very long time.
That's really. That's really interesting, Albert. The only problem with that, of course, is that in Finland's case and also in Austria's case, both of them are established and stable nation states. Iraq doesn't have the advantage of coming to the table as a stable state. And of course, the region itself is filled with malicious actors. Of course, we're talking about Iran now and also Saudi Arabia. I mean, the blood feud that's going on between those two countries, using Iraq as its chessboard, essentially, to carry out some really awful acts on the ground in the Iraqi state. Well, I mean, how do you Finlandize something like that?
Well, I think there's a couple of ways to do it. I mean, obviously, in the past few weeks, the Israeli defense minister has said, or has toyed, publicly toyed with the idea we're going to retaliate against Iran in Iraq, things like that. One way to do it is, it takes a page out of Reagan's book, but, to continue to exploit Iran being an overstretch. I have a suspicion that Iran is in, for lack of a better term, imperial overstretch. I don't know how they can continue to finance these foreign adventures they're in. They're in a lot of different places, and their economy is not doing well. Their banking system is, on Basel I rules, all these sorts of things. You have everybody and their brother with different actors there. If you can get them to agree to pull out or at least sustain some sort of a truce, that's one way. The second thing is to basically, almost give the different regions so much autonomy. That would be another way. And for a time, almost looking at the Dayton Accords as a model for this. Now, Dayton wasn't perfect by any means, and I know that there's problems now, but that could be another model to look at.
We'll now have our brief musical interlude. You're listening to Strategicon, the podcast of SIA. And that was Kurdish musician Jamshid with his 2009 hit Taniki. And now we'll return to our episode A Postcard from Erbil, featuring Professor Albert Wolf.
Overstretch is a really interesting idea here. We were talking about it, before we called you this afternoon, and that is, well, what happens in Syria next, where the Iranians are overstretched, the Russians are overstretched. You end up potentially with Damascus being theoretically in control, but having no resources to do anything. So if the Iranians are going to have to pick between Syria and Iraq, their capacity to influence either may gradually be diminished. And if Saudi Arabia keeps moving down the path towards both reform and repression in unequal measure, how much energy is it going to have for interference? There's all sorts of interesting questions here of how long the neighbourhood can keep being at this level of overstretch.
That is a terrific point. I think that the Iranians are really banking on making a lot of money out of Syrian reconstruction. I am not convinced that money is there. I don't think that my sense, and I'm not a Russia expert, my sense is that the Russians aren't. I think for the Russians, this is more about, they want to reassert themselves in the region, and it's also about status. But I really think that I'm truly convinced that the Iranians really think that they are going to make their investment back. I'm not so sure that's there. I think that if they're absolutely forced to choose, they're going to choose Iraq simply because it's right next door. And I think that they're going to try and continue to have this maybe principal agent relationship with Hezbollah and the various franchises that they've set up in Lebanon and throughout Syria to deter Israel. That's my guess.
So the irony with that is that potentially they keep their influence in Iraq, but Syria becomes more destabilized, meaning the Russians have to act there without the Iranians bringing local knowledge. So we potentially move the point of instability initially from Iraq to Syria, back to Iraq for a while, and then back to Syria. So it ends up being like a flip-flop of disaster.
Well, I don't know how unstable it's going to be, because you've noticed that you just saw the interception of that Israeli missile attack. I think that Syria could become a little more stable I don't think that Syria is going to be what it was before the Arab Spring. I think you're going to see pockets where the regime, controls things again. I think you're going to see pockets where it's going to be localized rule. And then I think you're going to see pockets where it's going to continue to be contested for some time. And I think they could. This is again a working hypothesis. I could see somebody like Assad trying to cut deals similar to what Putin cut in Chechnya, where they cut a deal with a thuggy warlord who sort of kisses the ring of Damascus but does whatever he likes.
One thing that hasn't been mentioned so far is Anbar province and how that's situated now within the sort of broader Iraqi framework. Arguably, since the high point of America's intervention in Iraq, Anbar has been the crucible of a lot of problems and the sort of sectarian rebalancing between the Sunni Arab sort of sub-state of Anbar province versus the Shiite majority in Iraq. How do you think a Finlandized Iraq could move forward when there doesn't seem to be much holding the Shiite rump of Iraq together with the Sunni rump of Iraq? We can't even begin to describe the relationship with the KRG, which is, doing its own thing anyway. So how could even a Joe Biden-style loose confederation work under these conditions where so much blood and treasure has been spent by local forces killing each other for, over a decade now?
Well, I think that one of the things that made the Biden plan work, was the surge. We did have elements of the Biden plan put in, even without calling it that. Now, I've heard people, I just forgot her name, the woman works at the Woodrow Wilson Center, but who said, well, the surge failed because the entire purpose of it was to create a political space to create a negotiated settlement. And it's true that negotiated settlement never took place, but it also only had 2 years. And these settlements take a long time. I think that part of what needs to be done is we need to bring back the awakening councils. We need to do things that, very simply, allow people to protect themselves and maximize their self-government and have some degree of even internal borders. I say Finlandized, I basically mean a neutral state. I don't mean it's obviously not ethnically or religiously homogenous, the way that Finland or Austria was, but it would be neutral and all parties would respect that so that it would stop being basically sort of a playground. I'm thinking you go back to Europe, of the Central Europe of the 30 years war and after, that's sort of what Iraq is like today. And it didn't stop being that way until, Central Europe didn't stop being that way until Napoleon came around and consolidated it from 300 to 30 German states. I don't know that would really work. I think that there needs to be decentralization. There also needs to be an oil plan. Let's just face it. Or the economy needs to change so radically that oil is relevant, which I don't think is going to happen very soon.
So it's really a case of trying to get multiple local legitimacies, and if each little group has a little bit of local legitimacy and accepts we can either waste resources fighting next door or we can let them have their bit of local legitimacy, and as a whole stop killing each other because we're being left alone. So it really is neutral in the sense of becoming inward looking.
Yes, precisely.
Yeah.
Precisely.
Albert, another thing has just cropped up while I was listening to you and David, and that is Israel's position not just vis-a-vis Syria, because we know that that's an ongoing issue, but also with Iraq. The idea of a unified Iraq with its own sense of self has, at least prior to 1991, always been considered a bit of a threat to the Israeli state. And I suppose from a very general perspective, Iran and Israel shared that one strategic concern, what to do about Iraq. Now, of course, we don't have the dictatorship of Saddam Hussein to worry about. We have a potential sort of never-ending chaos, a quagmire, if you will. So how does Israel play into the idea of a final strategic settlement of the Iraqi issue to its satisfaction? And then what would you say about Israel's situation with regard to its northern neighbor, Syria?
I would make a couple of points. The first is that, it wasn't just with respect to Israel and a unified Iraq. A big part of the problem was who was running Iraq. You look at, Israel, yes, had its share of problems with the Hashemites. But the big part of the problem was, Saddam and some of his immediate successors, some of the people who were running it post-58. It was not a unified Iraq per se. And then, they supported Kurdish independence up until a point. And then, whatever your stand on his politics are, Trita Parsi's a pretty good historian, and he's written 3 books. His first book details Israeli-Iranian relations and One thing that made them fall apart before the Iranian Revolution was there was this operation in Kurdistan that basically the Iranians screwed the Israelis. They pulled out because of the Algeciras agreement. So the thing is that the Israelis were always concerned about a unified Iraq because of who was running it and their intentions. If you go back into the 1990s, there is a famous so-called neocon document you can look at easily, and it's like a who's who of neoconservative thinkers like Paul Wolfowitz, and I think David Vermser wrote it, called Securing the Realm, in which it called for regime change in Iraq, but trying to put the Hashemites back in. Now, it sort of looks like a Rube Goldberg idea, but I don't believe that a unified Iraq itself is a threat to Israel. The second thing is that, if the more of a role that Iran plays in Iraq, that's going to be more of a threat to Israel. My guess is that is part of the reason why Israel was so willing to recognize Kurdish independence. Israel was like the only country that was willing to recognize it. Netanyahu all but got out and campaigned for it. And I believe that is a reason why the defense minister has said we're willing to retaliate against Iran within Iraq. To borrow a phrase, they're willing to use the long arm of, Israeli extended deterrence there. So, I take the Israelis at their word. So they're not just going to strike back in Syria, they're going to strike back in Iraq. The thing to watch out for is, will there be a diffusion of Russian, anti-missile technology, either on the part of the Russians directly or, indirectly from the Iranians to Iranian-supported groups within Iraq? That I can't answer. But I don't think it's about Iraqi unification per se. I think it's more about the loss of strength gradient that could be represented from a threatening Iraqi government.
There is one thing that I'd like to mention, and I know it's a little bit outside of the realm of the topic, but everything in the Middle East seems to be interconnected in very strange and bizarre ways, as we know. One of the key issues that unifies pretty much all of the states of the Middle East to greater or lesser degrees is the issue of Palestine. Now, if one were to say that Iraq becomes stronger, its ability to weigh in on the Palestinian issue becomes then a thorn in Israel's side. Similarly, if, for instance, by some miracle, the economy of Iran manages to turn around, which allows the theocracy to buy better weaponry and forward deploy forces on a sustained basis, up against the Golan Heights, for instance, with their Hezbollah allies, that in itself is going to cause a major problem for Israel as well, because the Palestinian issue is the sort of cause célèbre in the Middle East and has been since the foundation of Israel. Weak state or strong state, if everyone wants to play into the Palestinian cause and the mythology of Palestine, how does any sort of situation in the Middle East from a balance of power perspective play to Israel's advantage?
Well, I would make a couple of points. As it stands right now, I believe that a lot of states have used the Palestinians and their suffering very cynically. I don't believe that they really care. And I think that is particularly true of the Iranians. I think we're seeing that with the Gulf states, in which they're willing to ally with Israel. And you look at MBS, there have been all these stories about basically shoving any sort of a Trump administration plan down the Palestinians' throats. I don't think that there is a genuine caring about it. You look at some of the stuff that's been written in the past by guys like Michael Doran and people like that, and Yead Said and people like that. I think that the Palestinian cause has been used for status reasons among them. I think that among the so-called Arab street, it's mattered. I think it matters less and less today. How it's used by the Iranians, I don't know, because I think it's also going to depend upon what sorts of defense technology they have at their hands. I think it is, if they could ship stuff to, say, Hamas or, anybody else there, that's useful for them. Or I was going to say Hezbollah, which obviously is not a Palestinian actor. with Iraq and working with the Palestinians, I don't know how well that's going to work. The last time they tried that, it ended up getting a bunch of Palestinians thrown out of Kuwait. So I don't know. I think that the Trump administration cutting off aid to the Palestinians is a huge mistake. It could provide some people, like the Iranians, with an opportunity to step in. A lot of people theorize it could, give Hamas an opportunity to step in. But that's the extent of it. I think that for right now, Palestine is not the issue it was even 10 years ago.
Yeah, and really Iraq's issues at the moment are so immediate, whereas the Palestinians are stuck inside their walls. So for the average Iraqi, it's either skim money off the economy, skim money off the Iranians, the Americans, or the Saudis, and just keep hoarding what you can and waiting for the next bad time to come.
I think that's absolutely right.
Albert, the Trump administration has kept pressure up on the Russian and Iranian elements in Syria, but so far there is no indication that the US is in the mood for another major Middle East war. So the likelihood of increasing the American military contingent in Syria is small. Considering this, and the fact that Israeli warplanes and special forces have and continue to apply their own pressure on the Iranian presence, are we likely to see a significant change of America's disposition, especially if escalating pressure on Iranian forces encourages a more robust Russian response against the small US presence in Syria?
I think it depends upon what you mean by, what the Russian response is. I don't really think that Putin is looking for a war with the United States at this time. I think he would like the United States to, there was an interesting paper that just came out from NBR, the National Bureau of Asian Research, by a guy named Robert Sutter, who's at GW, and talks about, Sino-Russian relations. I don't think that Putin is reckless. I think he's an opportunist. And I don't think that he wants a full-blown war. But I do think that he's willing to exploit a power vacuum that be left by the United States. A lot of war games that have been played with Israel and Iran have shown the United States getting chain-ganged into a conflict. I don't see the U.S. really fundamentally changing its position because, Trump, during the campaign said, pardon the vulgarity, but he said we're going to bomb the hell out of ISIS. But then it's sort of like, and then we're going to be done. We're going to clear, but we're not going to, as they say in the vernacular, we're not, hold or build, which I think is a mistake, but that is the president's prerogative. So I'm not sure that things are going to change very much in Syria for the time being.
It seems from an outside perspective that the fates of Iraq and Syria are very much tied together. If a weak but reconstituted Assad regime prevails and a weak Iranian-aligned Iraq continues on its present path, could it be said that Tehran's strategic objectives of extending its footprints from its western border all the way to the Mediterranean have been accomplished? Barring a major war or an internal collapse of the Iranian theocracy, how do you think Israel, the Gulf states, and America would deal with this stark reality?
I think they've already begun dealing with it in the form of, we hear talk of, first of all, of an Arab NATO. Now, I think that there are problems with putting together such a force, from all the problems that come with alliance formation and management, which have been well documented in the literature and international relations theory, to interoperability of forces. But I do think that we're seeing that. I also think that what Israel's been doing in terms of, Ben-Gurion used to call it the periphery doctrine. I think that, Israel is revisiting that. I think that you're going to see, Israel used to have a relationship with Iran to contain, a variety of Arab states or to outmaneuver them. I think that Israel is going to start doing things like that again, only vis-a-vis Iran. I think that's what you're going to see. The question will be, how involved is the United States going to be? And right now, we have an administration that seems, involved or says it's involved. We also have a very capricious president. And it looks like we also have, we had a defense secretary who was saying we should abide by JPOA, opposed pulling out, but then, but has also had a reputation as being, talk on Iran, but he looks like he could be sacked after the midterms, and his potential successors look way more hawkish than he is. At the same time, we have a very capricious president who I'll be honest, predicting what he's going to do from hour to hour, much less day to day, is anybody's guess. The best guess is that what the U.S. could do with its Gulf Arab allies in Israel is simply containment. And yes, it does look like for the time, the Iranians could be winning and achieving their objectives in terms of getting this land bridge set up from Tehran to Iraq to Syria to the Mediterranean.
David, any final questions for Albert?
No, I'm just thinking about this land bridge idea that really, the longer Iran invests in it, the more it potentially starts to get gains. So if it's a case where it gets a little bit of time of being able to keep this in place, the longer it can stabilise it, it can show that it can provide the things that regional governments don't, that donors haven't, that the West hasn't. That, it's such a worthwhile thing for Iran to try and do. And in not acting now, we're missing a massive opportunity for genuine functional containment rather than pretend containment.
I agree with that. And I mean, it could almost, I don't think this would be anything on a par with like China's OBOR, but it could be something similar on a smaller scale that could do, basic things like provide jobs.
Yeah.
Something like that. So.
Albert, any final thoughts that you'd like to share with us before we bring this podcast to a close?
No, once again, it has been great being with you guys.
That brings this episode to a close. So, Albert, thank you once again for your insights. And, of course, to you, David, for riding shotgun with me.
Thank you all.
Thanks for listening, everyone. We hope that you'll join us for our next exciting adventure through the world of geopolitics. Remember that you can subscribe to Strategicon through iTunes, SoundCloud, Stitcher, TuneIn and YouTube, and please like us on the Sage International Australia Facebook site and follow us on Twitter. We appreciate your support. Also, please comment on any of our articles and podcasts through Facebook, LinkedIn, Twitter, and of course on the Sage International Australia site. We welcome any constructive feedback that can help improve our products, and we look forward to engaging with our followers. Until next time, goodbye.
Connect with your potential customers wherever they are. Effective uses Comcast viewership data insights to combine advanced targeting capabilities with premium TV and streaming content, so you can deliver the best ad experiences to your audience no matter how they watch. Visit EFFECTV.com.